Noam Wasserman spent over a decade at Harvard Business School, studying what happens to founders as their companies grow. And the single most important finding from his research, the thing that changed how I think about building companies, is this. Founders face a fundamental choice between being rich and being king. Rich means scaling aggressively, taking venture capital, giving up control, and building something massive where you own a small piece. King means retaining control, staying smaller, and building something where you call every shot, but the company never reaches its full-scale potential. And here is the gut punch. According to Wasserman's data, by the time a startup reaches its third round of venture funding, 50% of founders have been replaced as CEO. Half. The very people who started the company, who had the original vision, who mortgaged their houses and quit their jobs and convinced their friends to join, half of them are gone by Series C. The system that is designed to help founders scale is also designed to replace them. And the question every single founder has to answer honestly, the question that defines everything that follows, is, do I want to be rich or do I want to be king? Because you almost never get to be both. And I know what you are thinking. What about Zuckerberg? What about Bezos? What about Musk? They are both rich and king. True, but Wasserman's data shows they are extreme outliers. For every Zuckerberg who maintained control through dual-class shares and savvy negotiation, there are hundreds of founders who were pushed out by their own boards. For every Bezos who convinced investors to be patient for 9 years of losses, there are thousands of founders who were replaced the moment growth slowed. The richer king trade-off is not a universal law, but it is the default outcome unless you deliberately and strategically work to avoid it. And understanding this trade-off before you take your first dollar of outside money is the single most valuable thing a founder can do. Wasserman studied over 10,000 founders and 3,600 startups for his book, The Founder's Dilemmas. And one of the stats that really stuck with me is this. Founders who gave up more control, who brought in experienced CEOs and gave up board seats, ended up with companies worth 52% more on average. But they owned less, so their personal financial outcome depended entirely on whether the bigger pie compensated for their smaller slice. And in many cases, it did not. The founders who retained control built smaller companies, but they kept more of the value. Neither path is wrong, but most founders do not even know they are making the choice until it is too late. The moment you sign that term sheet, the clock starts ticking. Your investors have a timeline, they have fund return expectations, they need you to grow fast enough to justify their valuation, and if you cannot, they will find someone who can. That is not malice. That is math. A typical venture fund has a 10-year life. The partners need to return 3 to 4 times the fund size to be considered successful. That math demands exponential growth from every portfolio company. And your dreams of building something slowly and carefully, those do not fit a 10-year fund timeline. So before you take that check, understand that you are not just taking money. You are taking a partner with a very specific set of expectations that may or may not align with yours. Let me tell you about 2 companies that made opposite choices and both ended up becoming legendary case studies. The first is Mailchimp. Founded in 2001 by Ben Chestnut and Dan Kurzius as a side project while running a web design agency. They never took a single dollar of venture capital, not 1 cent. They were profitable from day one because they had to be. There was no safety net, no investor writing checks, just revenue from customers. For the first 8 years, growth was steady but unremarkable. By 2009, they had about 85,000 customers. Good, not great. Then Chestnut made a decision that changed everything. Inspired by Chris Anderson's book Free, he launched a freemium plan, free email marketing for small lists. The result was explosive. Within a year, Mailchimp went from 85,000 to 450,000 users. They were adding 30,000 free users and 4,000 paying customers every month. Profit increased by 650%. They hit 1 million users, then doubled the next year, then doubled again. Revenue reached $700 million by 2019 and $800 million by 2022, with 140 million customers. And in September 2021, Intuit acquired Mailchimp for $12 billion. All cash and stock, $12 billion. Let that number land. For a company that never raised a cent of outside capital, Ben Chestnut and Dan Kurzius owned the entire thing. They chose to be king, retained total control, built on their own terms, and became spectacularly rich anyway. And I want to pause on this because it is so rare and so instructive. Chestnut was not dogmatic about bootstrapping. He has said he was not anti-VC on principle. They just never needed it. Every year the company was profitable. Every year they could fund their own growth, and the critical insight was the freemium strategy. Before 2009, Mailchimp was a solid but unremarkable business. After freemium, it was a rocket ship. But here is the thing. Freemium only worked because the underlying unit economics were already proven. Free users cost almost nothing to serve because email is cheap at scale, and a predictable percentage of free users converted to paid. So the freemium model was not charity. It was the most efficient customer acquisition strategy in the history of email marketing. Every free user was a potential paying customer, and the conversion rate was high enough to make the math work. Chestnut's purpose, as he stated in a New York Times interview, was to prove to small businesses that creating success through bootstrapping was possible. And with a $12 billion exit, I think he proved it. Now let me tell you about the opposite choice. WeWork. Founded in 2010 by Adam Neumann and Miguel McKelvey. Neumann was a charismatic visionary with a gift for storytelling. He convinced SoftBank's Masayoshi Son to invest $4.4 billion in 2017, pushing WeWork's valuation to $20 billion. Son was so excited that he initially agreed to inject another $20 billion at a $47 billion valuation. The money poured in. SoftBank ultimately invested at least $18.5 billion in WeWork. And Neumann spent it as fast as it arrived. WeWork expanded to over 800 locations worldwide. They acquired companies. They launched WeLive, a co-living concept. WeGrow, a school. Neumann bought a $60 million jet. He trademarked the word we and charged his own company $5.9 million to license it back. He cashed out $700 million in personal stock sales before the IPO. And then the S-1 filing in August 2019 revealed the reality of $1.9 billion in losses. In 2018, another $900 million in losses in just the first 6 months of 2019. Dual-class stock giving Neumann 20 times voting power. Conflicts of interest everywhere. The IPO was pulled. The valuation collapsed from $47 billion to about $10 billion overnight. Neumann was forced to resign. SoftBank had to mount a rescue. And in November 2023, WeWork filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The founder who chose to scale at all costs, who took billions in venture capital and spent it on a vision of world domination, ended up with neither the kingdom nor the riches. Actually, that is not entirely true. Neumann personally walked away with an estimated $1.7 billion in loans, stock, and consulting fees. The investors lost almost everything. The employees lost their jobs. But Neumann got paid. That is the dark side of the scaling game. And I want to be specific about what went wrong at WeWork, because the lesson is not do not take venture capital. The lesson is about discipline and governance. SoftBank's Masayoshi Son met Neumann in December 2016 and spent just 12 minutes with him before agreeing to invest $4.4 billion. 12 minutes for $4.4 billion, Son later said he could tell Neumann was a next-generation leader. What Son could not tell in 12 minutes was that Neumann had no financial discipline, no governance structure, and no plan for profitability. The S-1 revealed a company that had $47 billion in future lease obligations against only $4 billion in committed future tenant revenue. That is a gap of $43 billion. The company was not a tech company, despite Neumann insisting it was. It was a real estate subletting operation with Silicon Valley aspirations and Silicon Valley losses, but without Silicon Valley unit economics. IWG, the company formerly known as Regus, had more office space, more revenue, was actually profitable, and was valued at only $3.7 billion, less than 10% of WeWork's peak valuation. The market was not rewarding WeWork for being bigger, it was rewarding WeWork for a story. And when the story fell apart, so did the valuation. And here's the part that really gets me. After Neumann was ousted and WeWork stumbled through restructuring and eventually bankruptcy, Neumann went on to raise $350 million for his new startup, Flow, a residential real estate venture, at a reported valuation of over $1 billion, before the company had any customers, before it had any revenue, before it had done literally anything. The founder who presided over one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in modern history raised $1 billion valuation for his next company based on what exactly? His track record of losing $18.5 billion of SoftBank's money? This tells you something important about the ecosystem. The venture capital world has a disturbingly short memory, and the ability to raise money is a skill entirely separate from the ability to build a sustainable business. Founders need to understand this distinction, because it is the source of so much confusion. Raising money is not validation. Let me say that again. Raising money is not validation. A high valuation is not proof that your business works. It is proof that you told a compelling story to people whose business model requires them to bet on compelling stories. Think about that. Same era, same type of company, shared office tools, and shared office spaces. One ended in a $12 billion triumph, the other in bankruptcy, and that contrast between Mailchimp and WeWork is what I call the scale equation, 5 principles that determine whether scaling will make you or destroy you. Principle 1 of the scale equation. Scale only when the unit economics work. This is the most fundamental rule and the one most often broken. Mailchimp was profitable on every customer before they scaled to millions. Each email sent generated more revenue than it cost to send. The freemium model worked because free users converted to paid users at a predictable rate, and paid users generated enough margin to subsidize the free tier. The unit economics were proven before the growth lever was pulled. WeWork's unit economics never worked. Every new location required massive upfront capital for build-out and lease commitments. The lease obligations dwarfed the revenue from tenants. WeWork was not scaling a profitable model. They were scaling a loss. And scaling a loss just means you lose money faster. The Startup Genome Project, which analyzed over 3,200 startups, found that premature scaling is the number one reason startups fail. 74% of high-growth startups fail due to premature scaling. Not competition, not bad products, not lack of market. Premature scaling, which means expanding before the business model is proven. The dot-com era is littered with examples. Cosmo.com raised $280 million, including $60 million from Amazon, to deliver snacks and DVDs in under an hour. The average order was $15. The cost to fulfill it was $25. They lost money on literally every delivery. They shut down in April 2001, laying off 1,100 employees. Boo.com, the fashion e-commerce startup, spent $135 million of venture capital in 18 months trying to launch simultaneously in multiple European countries. They shut down in May 2000. 18 months. $135 million. Gone. The pattern is always the same. Great idea. Broken economics, aggressive scaling, death. And honestly, this principle is so simple that it should be obvious. But venture capital creates a dangerous illusion. When you have $100 million in the bank, unprofitable growth feels like progress. The numbers are going up. Users are increasing. Revenue is increasing. Everything looks amazing on a dashboard. But if you are losing money on every transaction, then growth is not progress. Growth is accelerated death. The bigger you get, the faster you die. And the only thing keeping you alive is the next fundraise, which is exactly what happened to WeWorkandPets.com and Cosmo and Boo.com. The music stops and there are no chairs left. Principle 2 of the scale equation. Understand what you are optimizing for. Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansen at Basecamp, the project management software company, formerly known as 37 Signals, have been the most vocal advocates for intentional smallness. Basecamp has never taken outside funding. They have roughly 50 to 70 employees. They have been profitable for over 2 decades, and they have built products that millions of people love and depend on. Fried has said, "There is an industry that profits from founders suffering, and that is the venture capital industry. They want you to scale, to grow, because that is how they make their returns. But growing, for the sake of growing, is the ideology of the cancer cell." That is a direct quote, the ideology of the cancer cell. And I think he is right. Not every business should scale aggressively. Not every market rewards the biggest player. Basecamp is a great business precisely because it is small. Small means low overhead. Small means the founders retain control. Small means decisions are made quickly and the product stays focused. Every employee at Basecamp is known by name. Every feature is debated carefully. There is no bloat. There is no bureaucracy. And the company generates millions in profit every year while the founders work reasonable hours and live good lives. That is a different definition of success than WeWork's, but it is a valid one. Maybe even a better one. And I think what makes Fried and DHH so important to the conversation about scaling is that they provide a counter-narrative. The dominant narrative in Silicon Valley is, go big or go home, raise venture capital, hire aggressively, scale fast, capture the market. That narrative benefits venture capitalists enormously because their business model depends on portfolio companies growing fast enough to generate 10x or 100x returns. But it does not necessarily benefit founders. The vast majority of venture-backed companies fail. The vast majority of founders who raise VC end up with nothing. Basecamp's model, steady profitability without outside capital, has a much higher probability of creating sustained wealth for the founders. It is just a slower path, and in a culture that glorifies speed, slowness feels like failure. But Basecamp has outlasted most of the venture-backed competitors that were supposed to eat them alive. They have been around for over 2 decades, profitable every single year, while competitors have raised hundreds of millions, burned through it, and disappeared. DHH wrote a book called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work that argues the 80-hour workweek culture of venture-backed startups is not just unsustainable, it is unnecessary. You can build a great company working 40 hours a week if you are disciplined about what you work on. And the key to that discipline is not having investors breathing down your neck demanding quarterly growth. And then there is Craigslist. Craig Newmark founded it in 1995 as an email distribution list for San Francisco events. It became a website in 1996. And then Newmark made a series of decisions that are, from a purely financial perspective, insane. He never aggressively scaled the team. Craigslist operates with roughly 50 employees. 50! For a website that gets about 250 million visits per month. Most of its services are free. It charges for job listings in some cities and for apartment listings in New York City. And that is basically it. Estimates suggest Craigslist generates somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion in annual revenue. With 50 employees, that is $10 to $20 million in revenue per employee, which is absolutely insane. But the thing is, Craigslist could be so much bigger. Analysts have estimated that Craigslist leaves billions of dollars in potential revenue on the table every year by not monetizing its platform more aggressively. They could add payments, they could add advertising, they could add premium features, they could do 100 things that would make more money. And Newmark has chosen not to. He has said that the company's mission is to serve the community, not to maximize profit. And honestly, Craigslist is one of the most influential websites in the history of the internet. It disrupted newspapers, real estate, job boards, and classified advertising. It did all of that with 50 employees and a deliberately modest approach to scaling. The question is not, could Craigslist be bigger? Of course it could. The question is, should it be? And Newmark's answer for over 25 years has been no. And here is the counterargument that is worth acknowledging. By staying small, Craigslist left an enormous vacuum in the market. That vacuum was filled by dozens of venture-backed companies. Airbnb took the housing listings, Indeed and LinkedIn took the job postings. Facebook Marketplace took the buy-sell listings. Tinder and Bumble took the personal ads. Each of these companies took a piece of what Craigslist could have owned and built billion-dollar businesses from it. So did Craigslist leave money on the table? Absolutely. Tens of billions of dollars. But did Craigslist serve its community? Also, absolutely. And did Craig Newmark maintain the kind of life and company he wanted? Yes. This is the heart of the founder's dilemma. There is no objectively right answer. There is only the answer that aligns with what the founder actually wants. And most founders, if they are honest with themselves, do not actually want to run a 10,000 person company. They want to build something meaningful, make a good living, and have autonomy over their time. Craigslist delivers on all three. And speaking of unconventional approaches to scaling, if you are a founder building marketing content right now, let me tell you about AI Adsy. It is an AI tool that generates viral UGC and product ad videos. You give it a reference video, and it creates content designed for 3x better conversions. Whether you are scaling fast or staying lean, you need marketing that works. Check out AIAdsy.com. Okay, back to the equation. Principle 3 of the scale equation. Know your market's winner-take-all dynamics. Some markets reward the biggest player disproportionately. Social networks, marketplaces, operating systems, these are winner-take-all markets where being the biggest is a structural advantage. Facebook is more valuable because everyone is on Facebook. Amazon's marketplace is more valuable because all the sellers are on Amazon. In these markets, scaling fast is not a choice, it is a survival imperative. If you do not scale, someone else will, and you will be left with nothing. BlackBerry learned this the hard way. In 2009, BlackBerry controlled nearly 50% of the US smartphone market. They had 85 million subscribers at peak in September 2011. And then they failed to scale their operating system and app ecosystem to compete with iOS and Android. By 2016, their market share had fallen to less than 0.1%, one of the most dramatic declines in technology history. Nokia had a similar trajectory. In 2007, Nokia controlled nearly 50% of the global mobile phone market. By 2014, they sold their mobile division to Microsoft. Both companies failed to adapt and scale into the smartphone era. They stayed too committed to their existing approach when the market demanded a radical transformation. And I want to dig into BlackBerry specifically because the lesson is so nuanced. BlackBerry did not fail because they were ignorant. Mike Lazaridis, the co-CEO, actually saw the iPhone demo in January 2007 and reportedly said, "How did they do that?" He understood the technology was impressive. But BlackBerry was trapped by their own success. Their enterprise customers loved the physical keyboard. The IT departments loved the security of BlackBerry Enterprise Server. The carriers loved the efficient data compression. Every incentive in BlackBerry's existing ecosystem was pushing them to stay the course, and so they did. They released the BlackBerry Storm as their touchscreen response, and it was terrible. The screen literally clicked when you pressed it. A bizarre compromise between old and new. They launched BlackBerry 10 years too late, and by then, the ecosystem had shifted. Developers were building for iOS and Android. IT departments were adopting bring-your-own-device policies. The very network effects that had protected BlackBerry flipped against them. This is the scaling trap nobody talks about. Sometimes the problem is not scaling too fast. Sometimes the problem is not scaling in the right direction. BlackBerry was massive. They had the resources, the talent, the market position. But they could not pivot because their existing scale created organizational inertia. Every process, every team, every supplier relationship, every customer contract was optimized for the old model. The bigger you are, the harder it is to turn the ship. That is the dark irony of the founder's dilemma. Scale can protect you, but it can also imprison you. But here is the thing. Most markets are not winner-take-all. Most markets have room for multiple successful players at different scales. There is room for Basecamp and Asana and Monday.com and Notion in the project management space. There is room for Mailchimp and Constant Contact and ConvertKit in email marketing. There is room for Patagonia and North Face and Rei in outdoor gear. In these markets, being the biggest is not a structural advantage. Being the best for your specific audience is. And actually, in some markets, being bigger is a disadvantage because it forces you to serve the average customer rather than a passionate niche. Subaru is a great example outside of tech. They are not the biggest car company. They do not try to be. They serve people who want all-wheel drive, who love the outdoors, who value reliability over luxury, and they are insanely profitable doing it. Their customer loyalty rates are among the highest in the auto industry. And staying small can actually help you be better because you stay closer to your customers, make decisions faster, and avoid the bureaucracy that comes with scale. The key question to ask yourself is, in my specific market, does the biggest player win disproportionately? If the answer is yes, scale is not optional. If the answer is no, scale is a choice and you should make it deliberately rather than defaulting to the Silicon Valley growth at all costs playbook. Principle 4 of the scale equation. Scaling is not just about revenue. It is about complexity, and complexity kills. Every employee you add creates communication overhead. Every product line you launch creates operational complexity. These are not free. They have costs that do not show up on the income statement, but absolutely show up in execution quality. Amazon is a master of managing complexity at scale. Most companies are not. When WeWork expanded from co-working spaces into schools, residential buildings, and wave pools, they were adding complexity that their management team could not handle. Every new vertical required different expertise, different regulatory compliance, different customer needs. They were not scaling a core competency. They were spraying money at random ideas and hoping something would stick. That is not scaling. That is spending. And I think this is the most overlooked cost of scaling. Everyone talks about the financial cost. How much does it cost to hire 100 people? How much does it cost to open new offices? But nobody talks about the cognitive cost. Every new product line, every new market, every new initiative requires attention from the leadership team. And attention is finite. You only have so many hours in a day. You only have so much brain power. When you spread that attention across too many things, the quality of every decision degrades. This is why so many fast-scaling companies feel chaotic inside. It is not because the people are bad. It is because the complexity has outpaced the organization's ability to manage it. Jeff Bezos solved this with his famous 2 pizza teams rule. No team should be so big that it cannot be fed by 2 pizzas. That is a way of keeping complexity manageable even as the company scales. But most companies do not have Jeff Bezos' discipline, and most markets do not have Amazon's winner-take-all dynamics. And let me give you a real-world example of complexity killing a company from the inside. Groupon. Remember Groupon? Andrew Mason founded it in 2008. It grew faster than any company in history at the time, reaching $1 billion in revenue in under 2 years. They went public in November 2011 at a valuation of $12.7 billion. And then, The complexity caught up. Groupon was operating in 48 countries. They had acquired dozens of companies, including Distus in Indonesia, Clan Descuento in Chile, Sosasta in India, and at least 15 others. Each acquisition came with different technology stacks, different business models, different cultures, different regulatory environments. The sales team ballooned to over 12,000 people. Management could not track deal quality across thousands of merchants in hundreds of cities in dozens of countries. The deals got worse. Merchants felt burned. Customers stopped coming back. Revenue plateaued and then declined. Mason was fired in February 2013. He wrote one of the most honest CEO departure emails in history. After 4.5 intense years as CEO of Groupon, I've decided that I'd like to spend more time with my family. Just kidding. I was fired today. I genuinely respect that email. At least he was honest. But the lesson is clear. Groupon did not fail because of a bad product. The original idea was brilliant. They failed because the complexity of operating in 48 countries, with 12,000 sales reps across hundreds of acquisition integrations, overwhelmed the organization's ability to execute. They scaled the revenue without scaling the operational capability to deliver on the revenue. And that gap between scale and capability is where companies go to die. Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia understood complexity in a way that most founders do not. Patagonia generates approximately $1.5 billion in annual revenue. They could be much bigger. The outdoor apparel market is massive, but Chouinard has always prioritized product quality and environmental responsibility over growth. In September 2022, he transferred ownership of the entire company, valued at about $3 billion, to a trust and nonprofit dedicated to fighting climate change. Earth is now our only shareholder, he said. That is a founder who understood that the purpose of his company was not to get as big as possible. It was to make the best possible products while protecting the environment. And staying at a manageable scale, roughly $1.5 billion, allowed him to maintain the product quality and environmental standards that define the brand. Could Patagonia be a $10 billion company? Probably. Would it still be Patagonia? Almost certainly not. And Chouinard wrote about this so clearly in his book Let My People Go Surfing. He said that he never wanted to be a businessman. He was a climber and a surfer who stumbled into making gear because the gear that existed was not good enough. And when the business started growing, he had to make a conscious choice about what kind of growth he would accept. He decided that Patagonia would grow only at what he called natural growth rate. No aggressive marketing pushes. No chasing quarterly targets. Just make the best product, treat people well, and let customers find you. In the 1990s, when Patagonia hit a rough patch and sales declined, Chouinard actually laid off 20% of the staff and refocused on core products rather than expanding into new categories. He chose to get smaller and better rather than bigger and worse. And that decision, as painful as it was, is what preserved Patagonia's brand integrity for the next 3 decades. How many CEOs would make that choice? How many boards would approve it? Almost none. Because the default instinct in business is always more. More revenue, more customers, more products, more markets. And Chouinard had the courage to say, enough. Enough revenue, enough customers. That is a radical act in capitalism. And it built something that will outlast almost every hypergrowth startup that launches this year. And then there is Sara Blakely at Spanx. She started with $5,000 and built a billion-dollar brand without any outside funding. She retained 100% ownership for over 20 years. In 2021, Blackstone acquired a majority stake at a valuation of $1.2 billion. Blakely became the youngest self-made female billionaire on the Forbes list. And the reason she succeeded is precisely because she did not scale prematurely. She spent 2 years researching patent law on her own. Because she could not afford a lawyer, she drove to factories personally. She packed and shipped orders from her apartment. Every dollar of growth was funded by customer revenue. There was no point at which Spanx's growth outpaced its ability to deliver a quality product. The growth was always disciplined, always organic, always customer-funded. And I think Blakely's story is particularly important for founders who are told they need to raise money. She proved that a direct-to-consumer brand could scale to $1 billion without a single dollar of outside investment. It was slower than the VC-backed path. It took over 20 years. But at the end, she owned everything. She had total control over her brand, her products, and her decisions for 2 decades. When she finally sold a majority stake to Blackstone, it was on her terms, at her timing, at a valuation that she was comfortable with. That is the power of patient, self-funded scaling. You sell when you want to, not when your investors force you to. And you know what she did when the Blackstone deal closed? She gave every single one of her employees 2 first-class plane tickets to anywhere in the world and $10,000 in spending money. Every employee. Because that is what you can do when you own the company and you get to decide how the proceeds are shared. Compare that to WeWork employees who lost their jobs and saw their stock options become worthless, while Adam Neumann walked away with $1.7 billion. The way a founder exits tells you everything about how they scaled. And I want to mention one more bootstrap success because I think it is underappreciated. Atlassian. Mike Cannon-Brookes and Scott Farquhar started Atlassian in 2002 with $10,000 in credit card debt. They had no sales team for the first several years. They sold Jira, their project tracking software, entirely through their website. Self-serve. No cold calls, no enterprise sales reps. Just a great product at a fair price. They bootstrapped to profitability and stayed that way for years. When they finally went public in 2015, they had about 50,000 customers and over $400 million in revenue. Today, Atlassian is worth over $40 billion, and Cannon-Brookes and Farquhar are both worth over $15 billion each. They did eventually raise some capital, about $60 million from Accel Partners in 2010, but they did it on their terms, after the business was already massively profitable. They did not need the money. They wanted a strategic partner and some liquidity for early employees. That is the ideal way to raise capital. From a position of strength, not desperation. When you are already profitable and growing, the negotiation dynamics are completely different. You set the terms because the investors need you more than you need them. And speaking of growing smartly, AI Adsy can help you create marketing content that actually drives growth without burning cash on agencies. It is an AI-powered tool that makes viral UGC and product videos. Give it a reference, and it generates content for 3x better conversions. AIAdsy.com. Seriously worth checking out. Principle 5 of the scale equation. The best time to decide your scaling strategy is before you need to. This is the most overlooked principle. Most founders do not think about scaling until they are already in the middle of it. They raise a Series A and suddenly have $10 million to deploy, and no plan for how to deploy it. They start hiring aggressively, expanding into new markets, launching new products, all because the money is there and the investors expect growth. But the smartest founders decide before the money arrives what kind of company they want to build. Chestnut at Mailchimp decided early that he wanted to stay independent and profitable. Fried at Basecamp decided early that he wanted to stay small and focused. Neumann at WeWork decided early that he wanted to be the biggest co-working company in the world, regardless of the cost. These were all conscious choices. The problem is when founders drift into scaling without making a conscious choice, when they raise money because everyone else is raising money, when they hire because their investors tell them to, when they expand because the board is pushing for growth. That is how you end up scaling a loss. That is how you end up as one of the 74% of high-growth startups that die from premature scaling. And I want to talk about the psychological cost too, because nobody does. Scaling a company is one of the most psychologically demanding things a human being can do. You go from a team where you know everyone's name to a company where you cannot recognize half the people in the elevator. You go from making every product decision to reading about product decisions in a weekly report. You go from coding features yourself to sitting in 6 hours of meetings a day. And honestly, a lot of founders hate it. They started the company because they loved building things, and scaling turns them into professional managers. Ben Horowitz wrote about this in The Hard Thing About Hard Things. He described the difference between a peacetime CEO who optimizes and a wartime CEO who fights for survival. But there is a third mode nobody talks about. The founder who is scaling during peacetime and is absolutely miserable because they have become a bureaucrat running a machine instead of a creator building something. Ev Williams has talked about this. After Twitter scaled to hundreds of millions of users and hundreds of employees, he said he felt disconnected from the product. He could not just ship a feature anymore. Everything had to go through committees and approvals and reviews. And that is partially why he left to start Medium, which he deliberately kept smaller and more focused. The psychological cost of scaling is real, and founders who do not account for it end up burning out, making bad decisions, or both. I have seen it happen to founders who built incredible companies and then became shells of themselves because the company outgrew the thing they actually enjoyed doing. And I want to be practical about this because I know it sounds abstract. Here is a concrete framework for making the decision. Before you scale, answer 3 questions honestly. Question 1. If I stopped all external funding tomorrow, could this business survive on customer revenue alone? If the answer is no, you are not ready to scale. You are dependent on investor capital, which means you are building on borrowed time. Amazon could not survive on customer revenue for its first 9 years. But Jeff Bezos had a clear, specific plan for when it would. WeWork never had that plan. Cosmo never had that plan. The question is not whether you are profitable today. The question is whether you have a credible, specific path to profitability that is not just, we will figure it out when we get bigger. Because we will figure it out when we get bigger is not a strategy. It is a prayer. And Silicon Valley is full of founders who prayed their way into bankruptcy. Bezos had a very specific theory. If Amazon could achieve enough scale in e-commerce, the fixed costs of warehousing and technology would be spread across so many transactions that margins would eventually be enormous. He was right. But he had the math. He could show investors exactly when and how the unit economics would flip. He was not guessing. He was calculating. Most founders who claim to be following the Amazon playbook are guessing. They point to Amazon's years of losses as justification for their own losses, but they do not have Amazon's underlying economics or Amazon's discipline. They just have the losses. Question 2. Am I scaling because the market demands it, or because my investors demand it? These are very different things. If customers are banging down your door, if you have a wait list, if demand is outpacing supply, then scaling is the right move. The market is telling you to grow. But if you are scaling because your board set a growth target, or because your competitors raised a big round and you feel pressure to keep up, you are scaling for the wrong reason. Market-pulled scaling works. Investor-pushed scaling kills. Question 3. Can my team handle twice the complexity we have today? Because that is roughly what scaling does. It doubles or triples the number of people, the number of decisions, the number of problems, the number of communication channels. If your team is already struggling at the current size, scaling will not fix that. It will make it exponentially worse. Hire a VP of operations before you hire 50 more engineers. Build the management infrastructure before you build the product infrastructure. The companies that scale successfully are the ones that invest in organizational capability before they invest in growth. So let me tie this all together. The founder's dilemma is not really about scaling versus staying small. It is about self-awareness. Do you know what kind of company you are building? Do you know what kind of founder you are? Do you know what kind of market you are in? If you are building in a winner-take-all market, you probably need to scale fast, and that means taking capital and accepting dilution. If you are building in a market with room for multiple players, you might be better off staying lean, staying profitable, and growing on your own terms. If you care more about control than about size, the Basecamp model might be your path. If you care more about impact than about control, the venture-backed model might be right. There is no universally correct answer. There is only the answer that is right for you, your market, and your customers. But here's what I know for sure, after studying all of these stories. The founders who get destroyed by scaling are the ones who scale without a plan, the ones who raise money before their unit economics work, the ones who expand into new markets before they have dominated their first one, the ones who hire faster than they can maintain culture, the ones who confuse revenue with profit and growth with health. Scaling is not inherently good. Staying small is not inherently good. What is good is alignment between your strategy and your reality. Mailchimp aligned perfectly. Profitable model, patient growth, freemium at the right time, $12 billion exit. WeWork aligned catastrophically. Unprofitable model, reckless growth, billions in investor money burned. Bankruptcy. Basecamp aligned beautifully. Small team, focused product, decades of profitability, founders who live the lives they want. The scale equation is not about how big you get. It is about whether you get big for the right reasons, at the right time, in the right way. Get that equation right, and you build something that lasts. Get it wrong, and you build something that burns spectacularly bright and then goes dark. The founders who understand this dilemma, who think about it before they have to, are the ones who end up on the right side of the equation. The ones who do not think about it end up as cautionary tales. And I think the single best piece of advice I can leave you with is this: write down what you want before you start. Not what you want your company to be, what you want your life to be. How much do you want to work? How much control do you need? How much money is enough? What would you be doing every day if the company succeeds at the scale you are targeting? If the answer to that last question sounds like a life you would hate, then you are targeting the wrong scale. The founder's dilemma is not really about business strategy, it is about self-knowledge. The founders who know themselves, who are honest about what they actually want, are the ones who build companies they love running at a scale that makes them both successful and happy. The ones who chase someone else's definition of success, who scale because they think they should rather than because they want to, those are the ones who win the game and lose themselves. Choose wisely.